Well, on Wednesday evening, Donald Trump once again caught Washington by surprise by releasing a video from the White House from behind a presidential podium saying, quote, Christianity is facing an existential threat in Nigeria. The United States cannot stand by while such atrocities are happening there and in numerous other countries. Take a look at this clip for what he said next.
Radical Islamists are responsible for this mass slaughter. I am hereby making Nigeria a country of particular concern. That's a legal definition. When the Christians or any such group is slaughtered, like is happening in Nigeria, 3,100 versus 4,476 worldwide. What horrible numbers. Something has to be done. I am asking Congressman Riley Moore, together with Chairman Tom Cole and the House Appropriations Committee, to immediately look into this matter and to report back to me. And I mean, like, immediately. The United States cannot stand by while such atrocities are happening in Nigeria and numerous other countries. It's not only Nigeria, it's all over. We stand ready, willing, and able to save our great Christian population around the world. This is not going to happen. The killing of Christians is not going to happen.
Okay, so we stand ready, willing, and able to save our great Christian population around the world. Now, myself and many other Christians are certainly happy to hear the president's attention. Actually, even Nicki Minaj mentioned she was happy to hear the president's attention and focus had been turned towards the awful situation Christians in Nigeria are facing and have been facing for some time. What President Trump and some Republicans seem to be suggesting, Tommy Tuberville being one of them, is there could be a potential kinetic conflict in Nigeria. Obviously, over the last couple of months, as upwards of 40 people have been killed in U.S. strikes in the Caribbean, and Donald Trump has signaled a serious willingness, Secretary of State Marco Rubio as well, to escalate the conflict to potentially a ground war in Venezuela. The CIA has been authorized to conduct ground operations in Venezuela, just on the heels of Donald Trump's peace deal in Gaza, as he is attempting to broker a peace deal in Ukraine. Things could get more chaotic around the world if there are new wars added to the geopolitical situation as it stands right now. Well, today's guest is out with a fascinating new book. Ben Freeman is the co-author, along with William D. Harding, of The $1 Trillion War Machine: How Runaway Military Spending Drives America into Foreign Wars and Bankrupts Us at Home. Now, Ben is the director of Democratizing Foreign Policy at the Quincy Institute. And this book is very, very current. So I'm excited to talk to Ben on today's show. As a reminder, if you're over at undercurrents.tv, if you go over there, sign up, you get the full premium experience, meaning you get the full version of today's interview with Ben. So you get to hear our conversation actually about how big tech has become a huge part of the defense industry and how Donald Trump's relationships with big tech, personal relationships with big tech, are completely changing the sector. If you want to hear that part of the interview and the full version of the interview, also about propaganda, undercurrents.tv is where you can go. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Now let's welcome Ben Freeman. Happy to be joined now by Ben Freeman. He is the co-author of the new book, The $1 Trillion War Machine. Such a cool cover. The subtitle is How Runaway Military Spending Drives America into Foreign Wars and Bankrupts Us at Home. Ben is the director of the Democratizing Foreign Policy at the Quincy Institute. Ben, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Emily.
Now, I just want to start with the subheading because it feels so very current. And we were talking before we started recording this about how you've been working on the book for a couple of years, but How Runaway Military Spending Drives America into Foreign Wars and Bankrupts Us at Home. That's the subtitle of this book. I actually heard the president, when he was a candidate, talk a lot about that. And now we are careening towards a potential kinetic conflict with Venezuela. Actually, on the ground in Venezuela, of course, there's already kinetic conflict in the Caribbean, possibly Nigeria. As of the last 24 hours, the president is threatening ground troops in Nigeria. Help us sort of understand how the war machine functions, because it seems like we may be getting a good case study in real time.
Right. I mean, yeah. To your point, it's hard to keep up with all the conflicts. Like, where in the world is the U.S. military? And it's such a stark contrast to your point, Emily, about what we heard on the campaign trail from Trump. He was one of the only presidents in our time that was going on the campaign trail and calling out the war profiteers, calling out, how much they're making, millions of dollars for missiles. And he's like, of course they want to start wars, they're making big bucks, whenever we go to war. And so, folks like me were hearing that and we're like, yes, man, this is the message that we want. We know this is happening. To hear a presidential candidate say that, it was awesome. Unfortunately, when we're looking at the situation now, we're seeing President Trump. It was at least backed off from that a little bit, where you're seeing, like you mentioned, the conflicts in Venezuela, Nigeria. We still have this kind of support for Ukraine. I don't know if how what he's going to do there, sending weapons there. Of course, the conflict in Israel. He's been very supportive of Netanyahu too. And so you look at all this on balance and you're like, well, I don't know, this sounds a lot different from the guy who was calling out the war profiteers in the campaign trail. And Trump also, too, the other thing that really kind of cut against that campaign rhetoric was this summer, he's the first president ever to push forward $1 trillion Pentagon budget. And I want to selfishly say we had this title 2 years ago for our book, and Trump made it a reality like 3 months before it. So thank you, Mr. President, for that. But at the same time, what the heck are we doing with $1 trillion military budget?
Yeah, and so, I mean, there's this interesting thing in DC where there are people who are very much a part of the, quote, war machine, like a Lindsey Graham, but who are not purely motivated by profit. You can't just say Lindsey Graham is getting, kickbacks. The man is ideologically, I would argue, neoconservative. He would probably say MAGA, America First. That's probably how he would now define his foreign policy, but it verges on neoconservatism with some of the broader definitions of that. He really believes it. And I was hoping you might be able to help us distinguish between how the war machine, or maybe it's not even a distinction. How does it propel the ideology? Does it suck people into the ideology under, good faith? People who really want to defend. Nigeria is a very good example of that. People who really, Tommy Tuberville, against the ongoing war in Ukraine, but does care about Christians in Nigeria. How is the war machine operating in a case like that?
Right. I love that you brought this up, because there's this, we try to dispel a lot of myths in the book. And there's this one when it comes to money in politics, where people have this idea in their head that, some shady looking character, just comes in with a briefcase full of cash and then, slides it across the table and, vote our way and get rich immediately. And, in reality, you live in DC. I lived in DC for 10 years. Like, that just doesn't happen. Number one, it's illegal. But number two, that just doesn't happen, because it doesn't have to happen. It's so rare where you see money changing hands to fundamentally change somebody's beliefs. That's hard. That's a lot more money. So what happens most of the time in the influence machine, behind the war machine, is that you're giving money to people who already believe, who already, are supportive of, whether it's a neoconservative ideology, on the right, or on the left, it's this, sort of liberal interventionism, the U.S. needs to intervene in every humanitarian disaster everywhere all the time. Both parties have their sort of, forward facing kind of war machine folks. In all those cases, those folks believe that. It's not that, like, it's not the war machine is coming in, or, they're not coming in with campaign cash and saying, well, if Lockheed Martin gives you enough campaign bucks, then you'll go from a pacifist to a war hawk overnight. That's just not how it works. What a Lockheed Martin or, Northrop Grumman, one of the big contractors, is going to do instead, they're going to push money to a candidate who already believes in it. or somebody who's in Congress right now. A Lindsey Graham is a perfect example. Like Lindsey Graham has been a hawk for decades. There's nothing hawkish Lindsey Graham says these days that we haven't already heard in a previous there's no surprise that he's supportive of the Venezuela strikes in Nigeria as well. And so this is a thing we try to dispel in the book, that there's no real great villain here. I can't, when we talk about lobbying in the book, we can't just say like, we've unmasked them, Scooby-Doo ending, here it is, we solved the problem. Instead, it's just an incentive system where, if you believe in this more hawkish mentality, there's a lot more bucks to propel you forward in your political career.
Mm. Could you speak to a little bit of the experience Marjorie Taylor Greene is having right now? We can kind of maybe put some of
it.
See, the politics of it are obviously complicated because there's a shutdown going on, and some people on Capitol Hill are upset that she's maybe taking away leverage from Republicans. But we can kind of stuff that aside for a moment, because she's also getting just a lot of criticism for not going with the party line on foreign policy. And that's going back several years. Glenn Greenwald has been making this point a lot over the last couple of days. Do you see in the arc of Marjorie Taylor Greene perhaps an instructive example of what you write about in the book?
Absolutely. I feel like every time I see a new Marjorie Taylor Greene tweet, I'm like, I cannot retweet this enough. Like, thank you, Marjorie Taylor Greene. She is, I don't know. I feel like right now, Marjorie Taylor Greene is having this moment where it's like, Marjorie Taylor Greene is the member of Congress that all of us have always wanted. Mm-hmm. She's a Republican, but she's doing she's a MAGA Republican. She is a through and through, OG MAGA Republican. But yet she's saying and doing things at a time right now that are really cutting against the president's agenda. And she's saying just all the right things on, when it comes to the foreign wars, when it comes to, the Pentagon contractors' influence on U.S. foreign policy. And my favorite, because, my first book was about the foreign influence industry in the U.S. She's just saying absolutely all the right things about foreign influence in America. She even has a sign on her door, our congressional office door, just warning foreign lobbyists about coming in. And, it's clearly written for the Israel lobby. And it's effectively like, AIPAC, if you're coming in here, you might be in violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And that's on the front of her door in Congress. You go to see Marjorie Taylor Greene, you better buckle up, because she's not having that nonsense. So I don't know. I can't say enough good things about Marjorie Taylor Greene's presence right now. I don't know where this is headed for her. Are we going to have a presidential candidate, MTG in 2028? All I can say is I think it's an interesting, kind of uncomfortable spot. When I talk to, I'm a centrist, but I talk to some of my Democratic friends, and they'll say the same things that I am right now. They're like, I hate to admit this, but Marjorie Taylor Greene's my favorite member of Congress. I never thought I would say that ever.
That's so funny. Speaking of AIPAC, and this is, as you mentioned, the subject of your first book, Foreign Lobbying in general, the subject of your first book, AIPAC is called, obviously, the American, or it's short for the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, has gotten a lot of heat, especially after October 7th and the Gaza war. But people now are making a big push that AIPAC should register as a foreign agent. And the response has been, well, this is actually Americans who just really support Israel. And these are Americans who are freely, ideologically, of their own volition, supporting Israel because they genuinely love Israel. And I'm actually sort of persuaded by that argument as somebody who's reported on FARA, Foreign Agents Registration Act, but I could go both ways on it, because at the end of the day, if your ideology is support for a foreign country, then you're still doing the bidding of a foreign country. Help us understand a little bit of what's going on here, even just legally and then logistically on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's one I have been looking at for over a decade since I wrote that first book, The Foreign Policy Auction. You write a book about foreign lobbying, and immediately people are like, "Oh, Israel, right?" And I'm like, "Kinda." Sort of a little bit. The thing about AIPAC is it's exactly what you said. The thing about AIPAC when it comes to FARA is FARA is about foreign agents, but people who are working on behalf of foreign governments, especially foreign political parties. It's not just it can be foreign nationals too, just an individual citizen abroad who, might have some ties to a foreign government, that sort of thing.
But
There's
you're
a lot of
literally
misnomers about
contracted.
FARA.
Right.
Yeah, but FARA is very much it's focused on the foreign part of it. And so, if you're an organization like APAC is that as you mentioned, it's funded by U.S. citizens, it's run by U.S. citizens, and at least they claim all the direction and control of APAC is U.S. based. They do not take orders from the Israeli government. And so therefore, because of the direction and control is a real key issue under FARA, because, even if it is U.S. folks, if you're working under the direction and control of a foreign power, even if money doesn't change hands, that's the other interesting thing about FARA is like, you don't even have to have, a multi-million-dollar lobbying contract. If you're doing something at the direction and control of a foreign government, you still have to register under FARA. But that just, as far as we know, at least, that doesn't exist with AIPAC. There's no direct Israeli government control or Israeli political party control. We're told Netanyahu's not pulling the strings at AIPAC. AIPAC's doing this because some of these U.S. citizens and very wealthy donors, they just love Israel. And so as long as that happens, as long as that stays the case, or as long as that's true, AIPAC is not going to have to register under FARA, which is a huge pain in the butt for FARA nerds like me who try to tell people about the foreign lobbying industry. I talk about other countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, China, Russia, go down the list. But then everybody's like, okay, well, what about Israel? And I'm like, well, they're not registered under FARA. And they're like, inevitably, they're like, you don't know what you're talking about. Get out of here.
Yeah, go read a book on it. Maybe you could write one someday.
Yeah. What an idiot, this guy. He's such a hack. And I'm like, no, I swear I've written a book. It's over here.
Well, actually, let's talk about Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, because I think when a lot of people get sucked into the conversation about AIPAC for some very legitimate reasons, what they're directionally angry at is the idea that there is foreign lobbying that's like completely legal. You just have to you literally just have to register under FARA. And I feel like some people are actually just upset about that. And what we see from all of these Middle Eastern countries, I mean, Abraham Accords until the deal that was all the way through right now, the deal that's being, hashed out, that was agreed to, but is obviously being hashed out in the Middle East right now over Gaza. That was a lot of, perfectly legal foreign lobbying of, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, who have had immense business interests in the region. Donald Trump's family has immense business interests in the region. Can you sort of break down the dynamics that we saw play out with that?
It's enormous. It's a great, great question. And it's a perfect example, I think, of where you see foreign lobbying, the foreign influence industry, really steering U.S. foreign policy. And you go back to some of the countries you mentioned, the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords, foreign influence nerds like me, we saw that coming months, if not years in advance, because we saw all the lobbying happening for it in advance. When you file, where you register under FARA, you can, there's no real prohibitions on what you can do. You just register, you're transparent about it, you put the information out there. It's on this clunky DOJ website that's really hard for the average person to access. So like nerds like me have to go in and, figure stuff out. But, for those of us that were plowing through that, we were seeing this coming. You saw the Abraham Accords coming. You saw the Saudi normalization deal coming too. There's this, that's on the horizon as well. The U.S. might sign, something of a U.S. Saudi defense pact, not too dissimilar from what we just saw with the U.S. in Qatar just a few weeks ago. You had that coming too. All of those entanglements we've had with Qatar, from their U.S. military installation here, their deep ties with the Trump administration. That's another one that we've seen coming for probably 8 years now. Since about 2017, Qatar ramped up this super, lobbying influence operation on steroids, where they're spending tens of millions of dollars on lobbying and PR firms every year. They're spending millions more donating to think tanks, billions more donating to colleges and universities in the U.S. Qatar kind of came out of nowhere, and if you looked at Qatar at 2016, you would have thought kind of an afterthought in the foreign influence game in DC. But now they're clearly one of the top players, at least up there with the Saudi Arabias, and maybe not as influential as an AIPAC or as the Israel lobby, but they're not that far behind. And I think at least part of that influence operation is the reason that at least Netanyahu has to apologize after bombing Qatar. If Netanyahu bombs Qatar in 2015, there's no apology. There's not, he just wipes his hand of it and moves on. But as close as the Qataris are to the Trump administration now, because of this influence operation, that made that happen, in my opinion.
Mm. And what's also interesting about that example is we're having this broader conversation about the war machine, but in this case, it was a peace deal. Sort of foreign lobbying was the jet fuel behind. Have you seen that before? I mean, it does seem to be kind of a standout from that perspective.
It was very unique. It wasn't the first of its kind for me, but generally what you see in foreign lobbying in the foreign influence space is, I mean, it's almost like a social media influencer. The old joke about, like, what you see on people's social media profile that is just like a facade. That's what they want you to know about them. They're not going to put that, they're bankrupt, they got a divorce, and their dog keeled over. That's not going to make the feed. It's a similar story with the foreign influence industry. It's that when you're hiring lobbyists, you're hiring PR firms, they're there to put your best foot forward. And for Qatar, that really meant, a big part of it is a two-prong approach for the last 8 years for them. One, it was shooting down attacks on them. And, those attacks were coming from Israel, and they're sort of now kind of friends, but their enemies at the time, UAE and Saudi Arabia, had these big influence operations that were very aggressively attacking Qatar for its ties to Hamas, terrorism, all that sort of stuff. So Qatar's big push was to try and stymie those things, try to shoot those down, kind of play defense. If you talk to folks in this influence operation, I recently wrote a report on Qatar's influence operation and talked to folks who were like actively working in it. You talk to them today, they still say that their number one mission is playing defense, is shooting down these attacks on them. But a clear number two to that is hyping up what they want people to think about Qatar. And that is this peacemaker. That is this deal maker. As you look through the FARA filings, that's a huge point of emphasis for them. And so, there is it is a wonderful benefit, I think, to the U.S. that Qatar is brokering these deals. I think that's in Qatari's interest, in U.S. interest. But their lobbyists make darn sure that everybody knows about it. So when you think of Qatar, you may not think about human rights issues or any of the, the World Cup scandals,
Right.
any of that stuff. They want you thinking about Qatar as a peacemaker.
Well, and Qatar is also an interesting example in this case because not everything they do to influence U.S. policy, similar almost to China on probably on a smaller scale, is through hiring foreign agents. Some of it is donations to universities, right? Talk to us about stuff that's outside of the bounds, outside of the boundaries of FARA, that some, whether it's countries or political parties like Ukraine Party of Regions and the Manafort Podesta stuff, it's not just, I guess that's a bad example because that was FARA, but with China and Qatar, they're also giving to schools and that sort of thing, right?
It's the influence game right now has just gotten so complex and it's almost immersive. Like you're in this like virtual reality machine where influence operations today, sophisticated influence operations being run by all the countries you mentioned there, they want to hit you at every possible point. And so, they play the inside game with lobbying and PR firms, that's old school. You got to have that stuff. But they're also funding think tanks. And I think this is what, people outside the Beltway don't realize, that most of the time when you're hearing about some, foreign policy expert, you're hearing them on the radio, seeing them on TV, reading an article in your favorite paper. Most of the time, that person writing that article, they're hailing from a think tank, and that think tank very often is taking money from foreign governments or from the defense industry, from Pentagon contractors. And
Brookings and
very, very
Qatar.
often,
Right.
yeah, very, very often they're writing about those same countries that they're funded by, those same Pentagon contractors who are sending weapons to that war that they're writing about. And then there's these other angles too. It doesn't stop with think tanks. You've got universities, you've got media influence, and a huge one today that I think is in everybody's space is sports washing in the U.S. now. We're about to hit the NBA is going to start up. It's Emirates Cup again. You have Qatar buying a stake in the major DC sports teams too. The UAE also sponsored the U.S. Open. So everywhere you look now, you want to go enjoy a ball game. You're probably going to be privy to at least part of a foreign influence operation too.
It's remarkable. You've mentioned social media influencers and propaganda a couple of times, and this is one of the big parts in your book that I wanted to ask about. If you could speak a little bit to, in this new media environment, I remember bloggers getting caught up in Farrah scandals back in like the late aughts, early 2010s. That's something that happened as people were adjusting to new media then. Social media influencers and the $7,000 Israeli scandal that's bubbled up over the last couple of months. There's some uncharted territory. Talk to us about how propaganda is shifting for the war machine now. So to hear Ben's answer to this question and our broader conversation about big tech becoming a massive part of the defense industry, head on over to undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. See you there.